Tonight, I am going to be talking about Chapter 19, Developing a Healthier Relationship to Depression. The next chapter, Chapter 20, which is Depression and Courage. And this is from the book How to Do Life by Traleg Rinpoche. So it's important to have a relationship with depression. For one thing, almost everybody experiences it in one form or another during their life. For some people, it might be a very mild form of it that lasts only for a very short period of time. And for others, it might be more severe and long lasting. And it can, of course, come and go. It is not something that just shows up and then stays around until you die or you figure out how to work with it successfully. That it can come and go just like any other emotion or mood that we have. So the next two chapters look at depression, meditation, and Buddhist spirituality. He mentions Western psychological approaches and says, we're not going to go there. We'll let these people talk about it. They know more than I do, as he says. So the symptoms of depression are low energy and motivation, withdrawn, a tendency to be uncommunicative, irritable, resentful, and he also mentions difficult to be with. He feels that there is some stigma in the minds of other people about depression and people who have it. And as a result of that, we may try to hide it if we're experiencing it. We can even try to hide it from ourselves. It is often accompanied by some of the negative emotions like anger, jealousy, envy, and so forth. You might say it's not a pure state of mind or a pure experience. It can be mixed with many other negative emotions. He feels that generally it can be viewed as a terrible state to be in if you are viewing it as a state. As I said, a lot of people aren't even aware that they are depressed. They think that that's just the way they are and it's normal and this is the way the world is and it's all normal. But for people that are aware of it, they sometimes go to great lengths to hide it from other people. And when we are depressed, our self-esteem and self-confidence go down. We begin to doubt ourselves. We begin to think that we are a failure, that everything that we have tried, or almost everything that we have tried, has just not worked out. And you can think that there's something wrong with me. It's even possible to suffer from delusions, such as thinking that other people have the same low opinion of you as you have of yourself. Besides all those other emotions that I mentioned, there can also be anxiety, guilt, sadness, shame, envy, jealousy, all mixed up together. And it isn't like it, again, is solid. At one moment, you might be sad, and maybe later on in the day or the week, the shame is dominant. Envy might be entering in there at some point or another, and so on down the line. We just keep churning over and over again in our minds these different emotions, thoughts, and so forth. There's a term that is used, and it's rumination. And this comes from certain animals do, like cows. They will take a mouthful of grass, chew it, and they send it to their first stomach. And they fill up their first stomach, and then they sit down and they regurgitate it and they chew it and chew it and chew it. And then after it's been really chewed, they send it to their second stomach for digestion. And this is where rumination comes from. A cow is a ruminant, and we do that when we're depressed. We can do that when we're not depressed too, but we latch on to thoughts and we keep thinking on them over and over and over all day long. And problems get bigger and bigger and bigger by doing this. These thoughts and emotions just develop a momentum of their own. So this is a very common symptom or side effect of depression, this rumination. The definition of depression that I found in the book is, quote, the state of being in a particular mood of being pressed down. So feeling like there's a lot of emotional weight on you. The Tibetan word for depression is lack of courage, pressed down, feeling as though you were carrying the world on your shoulders. That's a quote from the book. The Tibetan word is Jum Pa. I find it interesting that in most talks about emotions by Tibetan Buddhists, there is little talk about moods. And here, Tralek Rinpoche does talk about moods. So I went to a source from Western psychology to see what they have to say about moods versus emotions. And I think this helps clarify this a little bit. Moods tend to be much more long lasting than emotions, going on for hours or days, whereas emotions may only last minutes. In a way, you could talk about the difference between weather and climate, or weather and the season, or the weather today versus what the historical averages are for the day, this sort of thing. So moods are more long lasting than emotions. The second point is the emotions are about something specific, a person or a situation or an object, but moods are much more diffuse. There's no identifiable object that is being involved here. A mood is a general feeling, not a reaction to a particular situation. So here it's like, you might say, background music. And the third distinction is that moods are not as intense as emotions, that emotions can be very strong feelings, such as attachment, fear, or anger. And to contrast with that, with a mood, you might not be consciously aware of being in a good or a bad mood unless you do a little reflection and look at how you have been responding recently, like in the past day or the past few hours. Have you been responding really negatively a lot, positively a lot, and so forth? If you look at things like being sad, being angry, being afraid, then you're probably in a bad mood if you look and examine. But when you're in a good mood, you tend to have positive emotions such as happy, being kind, loving, and so forth. So the nature of the emotion that you are feeling gives you a clue to the nature of the mood that you are in. Now I'm going back to the book. Tralek Rinpoche talks about three ways of relating to depression. And first of all, we have to realize that we need to relate to our depression, that we need to make friends with it. The first point is depressed states of mind are brought about by our own interpretations. Quote, the fundamental understanding that we need to have is that depression is based upon our interpretations of our life situations, our circumstances, our self conceptions, our notions of who and what we think we are. So he illustrates this with a story of the two sisters at their mother's funeral. And he is just trying to show that these two sisters interpret things very differently and disagree about what their interpretation of the funeral and how they reacted during the funeral is. And it is their differences in moods, feelings, and emotions that cause these different interpretations. The second point is that depression is not necessarily always bad. And here is a quote about this. When we are depressed, we may actually be able to see through the falsity and deceptive nature of the samsaric world. Depression gives us another viewpoint. And this other viewpoint is not necessarily completely false. This usually happens if it's not a severe depression, and severe depression can be a big problem. But here, this is more of mild depression. The experience of depression can cause one to reevaluate their life and their goals, to see things differently. It can cause you to examine your self-image, your values, the direction you're going in, and what's meaningful in life. And this can be an aid in our spiritual growth. This kind of depression, the rug gets pulled out from under you, and he used the word dangling with many questions and not many answers. This causes you to investigate and look deeper below the surface. And this gets us to start seeing that the world is interdependent and relative. And this helps us see through the allure of samsara. And this can help make depression workable. Number three is that we can change. This is the starting point in your spiritual journey, or you could say renewing your spiritual journey, beginning again. Drop the viewpoint that depression is bad. Look into what you can learn about it. There's actually light within the depression, and we can use this light to see more clearly. So there's work to be done. As you probably all know, I was experiencing depression when I came to meditation and Buddhism, and a lot of this I found was very similar to what I learned from the depression. So there are many different kinds of depression. He talks about depression that is liberating. Depression is a result of mental breakdowns, psychotic episodes, imprisoning depression. So liberating depression is insightful. It may be creative. It may increase one's intuition. It helps one gain non-discursive knowledge. And we can use it to become, quote, nakedly in touch with our emotions. So we can use depression for great benefit if we are able to, if we have the techniques, if we have proper understanding. This type of depression causes one to need to make sense of their experience, their worldview, and so forth. But in new ways, they find that the old way of looking at things doesn't work. And you realize that making sense of everything in the samsaric point of view is pointless, that you've run into a dead end. I remember I read F. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled just before I came in contact with Buddhism and was still suffering from depression. And one thing that stuck out from that book was that he said that depression was your mind letting you know that you are in an untenable situation, that it's not working, and it's time to look in a new direction. And that is exactly what Prahlad Rinpoche is saying here too. So if you can do that, you're using depression constructively. You can reframe depression as being a positive experience and use it in a constructive manner. You can use it to keep from being distracted by the various distractions and temporary pleasures that we're surrounded with in this 21st century. These endless activities where you just plain lose control of your life because of so many distractions out there, so much to do, so little time. This type of depression can keep us in touch with our emotions, our feelings, our moods, and ourselves. He even says that a touch of depression is like a state of mental equilibrium, that it can weaken our egotistical, self-indulgent view that we normally have. We start to reevaluate and check ourselves. We can't rely on the old familiar formulas, excuses, and so forth. We don't know what's going on, where we are. We question our assumptions, our attitudes, and our behavior. This is actually very important when we're on the spiritual path. This is a way of opening up to new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking, new approaches to life. He then talks about how being aware that we don't know is more important than being aware of what we do know. Quote, life itself is a learning process, and we can only evolve and learn when we are open. When we are aware of our inadequacies, then we want to improve. We want to learn. We want to try different ways. He then looks to the Christian mystics that he quoted them as talking about the dark night of the soul. He says that the Christian mystics felt that you have to experience darkness before moving forward. And then he says this is another way of saying this quote from Lao Tzu, who was Taoist. Quote, those who say they know don't know, and those who say they don't know. And that brought to mind this saying of Suzuki Roshi. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. And just to show you how my mind works, that reminded me of a rock and roll song from the 70s, which went, if I claim to be a wise man, well, it surely means that I don't know. I'll let you guess who the artist was. The point being, this depression can help us be humble and start realizing that we need to investigate, that we need to look, that our pat answers aren't working, and what we don't know is more important than what we do know. Quote, you have to have the experience of the carpet being pulled out from under your feet, and you have to experience yourself dangling and questioning, filled with doubts and uncertainties, not knowing what the hell is going on. Again, all of this is good, opens up our minds. It helps us see from a different perspective and so forth. This can lead to intuitive knowledge. He feels intuitive knowledge is necessary to travel the spiritual path, and it comes from doubt, uncertainty, and not knowing. This is the result of having the arrogance of knowing removed. So depression can be debilitating due to being overwhelming, due to the conflicting emotions. However, it can also be an aid to spiritual growth, can work one way or the other, or perhaps both ways. If we can look at it from a positive way, this helps. This positive way is questioning, examining, looking deeply and freshly. I have used the phrase the manure of our experience, and this kind of is touching on that. That manure is actually a very fertile material. It is rich with compounds and chemicals that nourish growth. If we look at manure as a word that begins with S, then we have a negative attitude toward it, and we're not going to use it as fertilizer. If we're not convinced about life's illusory nature, we can't really progress. We'll be attached to samsara. We'll be attached to this world that we take for granted. But if we can have the rug pulled out from under us, then we can start using the depression in a very nourishing manner. Quote, this is the end of this chapter. One of the first things that ego has to learn is that nothing in this world is stable or absolutely true. And a final comment, and that is about the difference between manure and the S word, is when I went out with Lama Karma to a friend's farm who had yaks for the first time. And he didn't believe me that they were yaks. He thought that they were a cross between a Western breed of cattle and a yak. And the yaks were hard to find that day. And we walked and he walked and we walked. And finally, we came to some yak manure. And when he saw that, he looked at it closely and then he said, it smells good. It reminded him that it was a true yak that we were searching for. So it's all in the way we relate to it. Now, chapter 20 is titled Depression and Courage, and that's what I'm going to go into now. One of the side effects of depression is a loss of concentration and a weakening of one's memory. And meditation provides an excellent antidote for these problems. With meditation, we learn how to concentrate, how to avoid distraction, maintain a sense of stability, how to resist yielding to upsurges of emotions and overwhelming feelings. Another way to put that is you can be more grounded if you have a meditation practice. He then talks about different kinds of meditation, and that's one thing about Tibetan Buddhism is there are lots of things that we can do. There are meditations that involve recitation and chanting. There are meditations that involve visualization. They frequently involve chanting or mantra repetition. Sometimes there's some yoga, Tibetan yoga, that is done that have visualizations that go along with them. And some meditations involve physical posture. There are a lot of mudras in Tibetan Buddhism, hand gestures. This is a prayer mudra. This is an offering mudra, and so on. All of this involves concentration, mindfulness. And then in shamatha, there's a posture that is involved when you're doing shamatha properly. And then finally, shamatha meditation is following the breath. And then he says there are some that don't involve any of these things. What came to my mind would be Vipassana, where you are doing some investigation and analysis. And then also Mahamudra, where you are looking at the fundamental nature of mind. So there is a sense of context with all these different types of meditation. And the ones that you do are the ones that are consistent with where you are in the path and what the instructions your Lama has given you. But all of these are about working with whatever arises in your mind and your body. If we're going to work with depression, we need to work with meditation. And in fact, sometimes when you are meditating, you might recognize that you are experiencing depression too, because it arises and is easier to spot when you're meditating. He says depression can even result from difficulty that you're having trying to meditate. One of the first or most common experiences you can have when you meditate is compared to a waterfall where the water falls over a cliff and is totally out of control and is bouncing off the rocks on the face of this cliff and incredibly turbulent. That can lead to depression. You start thinking meditation, it was supposed to be calming and happy and blissful, and that's not what I'm experiencing. So this all can lead to a mild form of depression all by itself. So to go into this more deeply, he has a number of different sections that are about meditation and other things. The first one is courage and meditation. The second is awareness and meditation. The third is joy and meditation. And the last one is love and compassion and meditation. So, getting to the first one, courage and meditation. Courage here means we need to be willing to work with the depressed state as opposed to trying to get away from it or eliminate it. The courage is letting it arise, but avoid getting caught up in the endless rumination that we have about it. If we can approach everything that we experience courageously and fearlessly, these experiences will have no lasting effect on us. We will become more empowered by them. So, courage means feeling capable of dealing with whatever arises. When we start thinking about negative outcomes, then fear, anxiety, resentment, guilt, self-condemnation, frustration, all kinds of thoughts and emotions arise. And the emotions, of course, are all backed up with more thoughts. He has talked in previous chapters about how thoughts and emotions are very, very closely tied up, and it's difficult to separate them. And then he says something very interesting, quote, "This lack of courage is almost like a pathological need to protect ourselves. It is not our experiences, but our reaction to them that cause the damage." So you feel very vulnerable, exposed, and our ego feels a lot of fear and wants to protect itself. And so we have all kinds of monologues going on, this monkey mind going on, this soap opera going on. And it is this soap opera or monkey mind that is so disturbing, not the experience itself. So courage is here accepting and accommodating whatever arises in this depressive state of mind when you're meditating or even when you're not meditating. As a result, these intense reactions will gradually diminish in strength and you'll be able to let go of them. Maybe a better way to put it is you'll be able to let go of them easier. And the strength that they have is really about how strongly you want to grab a hold of them. The next is awareness in meditation. So courage brings awareness in meditation. And awareness simply means being able to see what's going on. So when we have courage, we are not hiding from unpleasant and frightening thoughts, emotions, and experiences. The usual response is to hide from the frightening or go into denial or ignorance. And I like to use ignorance, pronouncing it this way: ignore ants. We just want to ignore it, pretend that it doesn't exist or that it's not a problem or we're not bothered by it, sweep it under the rug, so to speak. So if we can allow ourselves to experience depressive moods, thus we are aware of them, and it is courage that allows us to be aware of them, and then it is the awareness that allows us to get to know them and to see through them and realize that they're really a paper tiger. This awareness is a process that you become aware of that mental state changing. The stronger your awareness gets, the more you realize that what you are aware of is not solid, that it is changing. It might arise 30 minutes later, but it's different in some way or another. So depression has subtle changes. It's always slightly different. Sometimes the differences are much bigger, and awareness sees all of this. This awareness sees through the solidification of depression and depressive moods. It realizes that it is not like a stone wall. If nothing else, there are cracks in that stone wall. Posture in meditation is important. He feels that our shoulders should be extended, which is back, the chest out. And he talks about this showing our inherent majesty and royal bearing. He has a nice way of saying this. The Tibetans, in these classic texts, they talk about the vulture posture, where the vultures are sitting with their wings back and their chest out. And vultures are looked at with a lot of respect in Tibet. But here in this country, vultures aren't so majestic. So he talks about the royal bearing. Again, it's all in our minds. Are you talking about royal bearing or the vulture posture? Whatever makes you feel that this is a good posture to be in and that there is this feeling of majesty. That's the important thing. By having that posture, this counteracts the tendency that you can have when you have depression of feeling defeated, worn down, of slouching like that. That is not a good posture to be in when you meditate. That body posture tends to affect your thoughts and your emotions in a negative way. So, besides having that posture, you want to pay attention to what's happening now. Going into the past or the future diverts our attention from now. Now, this doesn't mean that the past has no bearing on the present. He talks about it's due to karma that we are where we are now. It is due to past conditions and causes and so forth that we are where we are now. But now we want to be present and not dwell on the past. The past is past. You can't redo the past. Quote, when we pay attention to what we are experiencing now through awareness, we are able to determine our karmic history in the future by making it a different course. In other words, by paying attention to what's happening now, we are creating karma that will lead to a different future than more of the same old, which comes to mind Groundhog's Day. Won't go into that any more than that. I'll let you think about that. So without awareness and attention, nothing changes. He also points out that now is just a concept. We have to pay attention and realize what we are paying attention to is not a concept. We are experiencing what's ever happening freshly. And that if we are saying, quote, I'm in the now, you're not in the now. You're stuck in a concept. And the only way to experience now is to have awareness. Next comes joy and meditation. Joy here means a sense of physical and mental well being. On the other end, elation is a big problem because you always crash. You just go up and down, up and down, up and down, and that makes things worse. He says the Tibetan word for joy means not being like a yo yo, not going from elation to depression over and over again, that this joy is steady. And that is the kind of joy we want to have. Quote, joy here means the underlying mental attitude that we have developing a joyful disposition. This means that when things go in a different direction or not our way, we quickly regain our balance. Equilibrium is a word that he used. And this would be like, well, you win the lottery. Then a month later, when the doctor tells you you have 6 months to live, you're not going up and down, that there is this equilibrium there. For those of you that have ever ridden a horse, a person that is a good rider, when the horse shies and suddenly jumps to one side or the other, stays on the horse and quickly regains their balance, perhaps never even loses their balance, versus a person that's not an experienced horse person ends up on the ground. So it's that kind of equilibrium. And this is not a detachment from what's happening or being numb, that this sense of joy is not conditional. It's coming from within. It's a mental attitude. He uses the word cheerful disposition. So if we learn how to work with what arises with courage and awareness, joy will be present. On the other end, there's no room for joy if we think things should be better or if we fight against our own experience. So he tells a story of this man who is only satisfied with the very best. And he's always constantly looking for the very best, but as a result, he's not satisfied with what he has. And he develops tonsillitis and he keeps looking for the best doctor for the surgery. He travels from area to area to area. And finally, when it's absolutely necessary, looking for the best doctor, of course. And finally, he ends up in an isolated small village. And the only one that has worked on a living being with a knife was the butcher. So the butcher ends up doing it. This reminded me of the Hungry Ghost realm, where you're always looking for what you can't find. and never satisfied. We need to drop this idea of we're going to have joy, that things are supposed to be better, and just accept what is there and maybe strive to have things better. But in the meanwhile, accept what's going on and realize that just because we would like things to be different doesn't mean we have to fight it. So we should not always be thinking that things should be different, that something else should be happening based on our own wishes. I remember hearing this phrase. It's been decades since I've heard it, but I think this sums it up. And that is, if I ran the zoo, things would be different. And we all, I think, could have then fill in, well, if I was in charge of things, I would, yeah, well, I'm glad I'm not in charge of things. The next section is love and compassion and meditation. To begin with, love is defined as wishing that others have happiness and the cause of happiness, the first of the four immeasurables. And compassion is wishing that others be free of suffering and the cause of suffering, the second of the four immeasurables. Both of these are necessary to work with depression. In a depressed world, this world is cut off and lonely. The suffering is internalized, where love and compassion involves both ourselves and others. We really can't grow without others to have love and compassion for. And he uses the Bodhisattva as an example for this. When we are depressed, we don't feel worthy of receiving love or compassion, and certainly not giving it to others. My experience with depression is that you probably hate yourself, not love yourself, that you don't even have any love for yourself, or very little at some times. So mind training helps us work with that poverty mentality. Through Tonglen and other techniques in mind training, we realize that we have something to give ourselves and something to give other people, and that we don't need anything in return, in that we have a sense of being enriched by giving. He then tells two stories. Both of these do not come from Tibetan Buddhism, they come from the West. The first is a Russian ruler, Prussian, excuse me, and I suspect he might have considered himself a emperor, and he demanded his subjects love him even though he was very wrathful and angry. So this one subject saw him walking down the street and tried to hide, and the emperor caught up with him and asked him why he was trying to hide, and he came out and blurted, "I'm afraid of you." And of course, then the emperor got mad at him, because you're supposed to love me. Well, he wasn't getting any love because it was anger. I believe that's the point of that. Then the second was the woman who goes to the registrar's office angry, and she says that she's gotten a marriage license, but Jacobson escaped. And what are you going to do about it? That's, I guess, would be equivalent out here to going back where you got a hunting license and saying, I didn't get a deer, I want my money back. Yeah, the point is that neither one of these people were feeling enriched by being so stingy and not accepting what's going on in their lives. So love and fear are contradictory. Love, you might say, is the antidote for fear and anger. The emperor wanted his subjects to love him. Well, it started with him loving his subjects, and that this gift of love or compassion is in the actual act of giving without conditions or expectations. And if there weren't others, we wouldn't be able to give without conditions and expectations. We need others. Without others, we would be lonely, cut off, and miserable. And it is others that bring meaning into our lives, that others help us grow. Even difficult people can help us grow. The Tibetans say our worst enemy is our best teacher. We all have karmic connections that we're not aware of to people all over the world. In the West, individualism is a problem because it doesn't see these karmic connections frequently. It can be interpreted to mean we don't have to respect others and just do whatever we want to do. But we need to have this feeling of belonging and connection. There needs to be an awareness of this larger context, the community that we are part of. We need to be involved in creating social harmony, and that love and compassion are very important to community. And he feels both on a secular level and a spiritual level. So, practicing love and compassion, along with other virtues, will keep what Winston Churchill referred to as his black dog at bay. And I had to go to the internet and look that up. I'm not British. Perhaps some of you from Canada understand this right away, but Winston Churchill would have prolonged periods of depression that he suffered from throughout his life. So the idea here is that practicing love and compassion will keep that prolonged depression at bay. Now, the depression doesn't necessarily go away quickly. Thinking that it will is a mistake. It will gradually decrease, and our ability to use it in a productive, positive way will gradually increase over time. Quote, if we are able to meditate and learn to develop courage, awareness, joy, love, and compassion, we will grow and depression will dissipate. The point is to get to know depression, get to know how it works, its characteristics, make friends with it, learn from it, and gain wisdom. The question is, when I was in the depths of depression, if someone told me you need to meditate, I would have told them, screw you. What do you do to get people like that to meditate? I will say that when I was in the depths of depression, I was in the same place. I was married at the time, and my former wife left out a simple little book that had nothing to do with Buddhism, but it talked about working with our moods and emotions in a way. And finally, my curiosity got the best of me, and I opened the book and read it partially, and then I put it down and said to myself, this is Southern California bullshit. And then came back a couple of weeks later and read a little bit more and then put it down. Eventually, I realized that I was happier by following some of the things. Where I'm going with this is that you've got to be kind of subtle and come on in a very gentle way. Use your wisdom. You could almost say, lure them into meditation. You could talk about how, again, briefly, about how you've noticed benefit from meditation. I know when I have talked at great length to people about meditation and Buddhism, pretty soon the eyes glaze over and we never talk again about these things. So it's kind of trying to arouse the other person's curiosity. And again, I wish I had a hard, fast formula, but there never will be. It's trying to figure out a way to get around their barriers. The question is, a good friend of mine, his son commits suicide, and I'm not sure how to approach this with my friend. He obviously is really suffering. What can happen when there is a death in the family, or even a death of a friend? You go into a period of being detached from reality, of really being in a world that emotional and very, very painful. And it's very irrational. And one direction that a person can go in is blaming themselves, thinking, well, there must have been something that I did that caused them to commit suicide, or there was something that I could have done that would have prevented this from happening. And therefore, I caused the person to do this. It's called survivor's guilt. And even if there isn't any survivor's guilt, it still can be very devastating for the person who loses a child. I've heard this a number of times. And this isn't the way it should be. The parent should die before the child. And a feeling of this is just unfair. Take your pick of what level. The universe is being unfair. God is being unfair. It's just unfair. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with the post mistress in the Ridgeland post office. And she was a very outgoing person. And being Ridgeland, there was never a line. Ridgeland's population of 275 people, give or take 10 or 12. And she had on her counter a small porcelain figure of Lucy in her psychiatric booth, with a cup with a nickel on it. And she said she put that there because people would come in and just unload on her, tell her all kinds of things. Then I was in the post office later on. I don't know, could have been a year or two after she told me that story. And she told me this story, that she got married, became pregnant, gave birth to a beautiful child, and about a year later, child was dead in its crib, sudden infant death syndrome. And she was devastated. And she went to the library and read everything she could get her hands on about working with death. And then she would write off to the authors. And she got one and only one response, and it was from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it was, well, I do programs. Why did you attend some of them? And so she did. And the very fact that she did something perhaps was as important as going to her particular seminar. But anyway, it gave her tools to work with her grief, her loss, her feelings. For those of you that don't know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the one who first came up with these different stages of grieving. Well, this helped her work through this. She got pregnant again, gave birth to another child, and the child was, I think, graduating from high school about the time that she was telling me this story. I really think that it was that experience and perhaps other things in her life because of interdependence that allowed her to have such a presence that people wanted to talk to her about their problems, that it opened up her heart more. It made her understand life better. So to kind of wrap this answer up, just like we're talking about depression, that these kinds of experiences can also lead to spiritual growth. There is a saying in Western psychology, post-traumatic growth. Don't expect to be able to use logic or reason with the parents at this point in time. What I would recommend is just plain listening, that it's just going to take a while before the person becomes, you might say, somewhat rational. Being there for them is really important.